Welcome to episode 244 of the Pharmacist Voice podcast. I'm the host, Kim Newlove. I'm a pharmacist by training, but I'm not in clinical practice anymore. I am a voice actor and a podcast host. Medical narration and podcasting are my specialties. You can find the show notes for this episode on my website, thepharmacistvoice.com. If you're new to the Pharmacist Voice podcast, welcome. Today's episode is for pharmacy professionals who are interested in podcasting. When I say pharmacy professionals, I am talking about pharmacists, pharmacy students, pharmacy technicians, pharmacy professors, retired pharmacists, pharmacy owners, and frankly, anyone who thinks like a pharmacist, meaning you're detail oriented, you like evidence based information, and you like a straight shooter. I am a straight shooter for sure. If you're interested in podcasting, this episode is for you. This episode will answer 3 questions for you. I'll list those questions first, then we'll dive into each one. Question number 1 is, how can this episode help me plan a podcast? Question 2 is, what topics do I need to think about when planning my podcast? And question number 3 is, I'm interested in podcasting, but what's the first step? Let's dig deeper into that first question. How can this episode help me plan a podcast? Mindset first. I'm going to say something that you need to hear. Podcasting is a creative act. Create a recipe, not a statue. Now, imagine that you're holding a blank 4x6-inch recipe card in one hand, and in the other hand, you're holding a statue of the Eiffel Tower. The statue's 9 inches tall and made of metal. As you look at that imaginary recipe card in your hand, imagine that all the choices that go into creating your podcast, all the ingredients, are written on that recipe card. You could change that recipe by taking a pen and crossing out one ingredient or adding another, right? Recipes are flexible like that. It's easy to change a recipe. Now, as you think about that Eiffel Tower statue, it's made of metal, it's in your other hand, it's imaginary, of course, but as you think about it, how easy would it be to change the features of that statue? It has legs, it has a base, and it's got the tower part. How hard would it be to change something about that statue? It would be hard. You might have to get a blowtorch or maybe take a hammer and smash it up. It's hard to change a statue. I think you get my point. It's easy to change a recipe, it's hard to change a statue. As a podcaster, don't build a statue. That statue, you won't let yourself change it. You may not get your recipe right on the first try. I'm going to tell you that straight up. You need to prepare yourself for that. Pharmacists can be perfectionists. We spend a lot of time not killing people with medicine. Am I right? But we're talking about podcasting right now. Podcasting is different. Adopt an open mindset as you start writing your initial podcast recipe. There's more than one way to create a podcast, and you can change your recipe as you go. Try things and iterate as needed until you find something that works well for you. Speaking of recipes, have you ever found a food recipe and told yourself, I'm going to make this, but then you never do? That has totally happened to me. I had a recipe for a peppermint ice cream pie. It was in my recipe box, I'm embarrassed to say this, more than 10 years, and I just never made it. How do I know it was 10 years? There was a date on it. I think I pulled it from a magazine. Anyways, one year I came across it. I said, who am I kidding? I'm never going to make this. And I recycled it. I was basically just looking at this thing thinking it's a plain graham cracker crust with some melted ice cream in it and some crushed candy canes on top. It was just maybe too easy. I don't know. The point is, with any recipe, we can make it right away, or we can hang on to it for a while, or we can just throw it out. That could happen to you with podcasting. Keep in mind, as you write your initial podcast recipe, that you can hang on to it for months or years and never use it or make it right away. It's just like that peppermint ice cream pie recipe. It's up to you whether you use your recipe or not. Part of what I do is help pharmacy professionals plan podcasts so that they have that recipe in their hands. They can't decide what to do about podcasting until they have the recipe. They can't decide to start it right away or hold on to it or walk away. And by the way, waiting or walking away looks different for each individual that I help. They may start a podcast next year instead of this year. It's okay to wait. They might hold off on launching the podcast until they can find a production partner that they can outsource the MP3 production to. There are lots of different ways to make a podcast. Some people, when they walk away, they might build a YouTube podcast. That's a video only podcast instead of a traditional audio podcast. And that's fine. But they had that recipe, they went through the steps so they could make an informed decision. Some people also do LinkedIn Lives instead of starting a podcast. That's totally fine. And some people like pod guesting, being a guest on a podcast for a while to see if they even like the sound of themselves on a podcast and see how they feel about their voice being broadcast around the world. Everyone is different. It's all about the recipe. Once you have the recipe, the plan, then you can decide what to do with it. I am of the opinion that if you're interested in starting a podcast, you owe it to yourself to go through the planning process before you decide what you are going to do. Just like a recipe, you don't make it first. You might revisit it down the line. So I challenge you to write your initial podcast recipe and then consider all your options. I help pharmacy professionals plan podcasts with a self paced online course, which you can find at kimnewlove.com. That's KIMNEWLOVE.com. There's a link to that in the show notes. What I've got is something called a behind the scenes look at the Pharmacist Voice podcast. That is my self paced online course. I help you plan a podcast by showing you behind the scenes of mine. People ask me all the time how to start a podcast. Thank you for trusting me with that question. But in digging deeper and talking to dozens of people in the pharmacy profession, they just want to know how I started mine. So in my course, I show you how I started the Pharmacist Voice podcast. But I also give you ideas for starting your podcast. There's a worksheet with planning questions, and if you watch all of the modules and answer all of the questions, you'll have a plan for your very own podcast. It's up to you then when you want to launch. Now let's get into question 2, which is what topics do I need to think about when planning a podcast? Here's a list of 11 topics you need to think about when planning your podcast. Number 1, your why. Number 2, how you'll get started. And here's a hint: find someone you trust and listen to them. Number 3, how long does it take to go from idea to published? Number 4, tools and gear. Number 5, research and reflection. Number 6, writing. Number 7, creating MP3 files. Those are your audio files. Number 8, artwork. Number 9, podcast hosting platforms. Number 10, a podcast website. And number 11, advertising. By the way, all 11 topics are covered in my self-paced online course, which again, you can find at kimnewlove.com. The third and final question is, I'm interested in podcasting. What's the first step? The first step is your why. You need to figure out why you're starting a podcast. What's in it for you, the podcaster? Who's your audience? Who are you talking to? What's in it for them? And what do you, as a podcaster, want your listeners to do with the information? The answers to all those questions collectively is your why. Once you have that, it will help you every time you step up to the mic. You'll know exactly who you're talking to, what they need to hear, why you're telling it to them, and what you want them to do with the information. Figure out your why and uncover your passion for being a podcaster. Then there's no stopping you. That does it for the 3 questions I introduced at the beginning of the episode. Now you know how this episode can help you plan a podcast, 11 topics you need to think about when planning your podcast, and what the first step is. Do your research, create your recipe, plan before you launch. I know what it's like to start a podcast and feel like you don't know anything. Although I can't tell you everything that you need to know in a 10 to 15-minute podcast episode, now you at least know enough to get started. That was me 4 years ago, not knowing anything, and look where I am now. I have 2 podcasts, and I've produced over 250 episodes in the last 4 years. If I can do this, you can do it too. If starting a podcast is on your to-do list, I encourage you to buy my self-paced online podcast planning course for pharmacy professionals. The cost is $249 US, and you can find it at kimnewlove.com. There's more than 70 bite-sized video lessons for a total of 7.5 hours of content. That's at regular speed. If you want me to sound like a chipmunk, you go ahead and crank that up to 2 times. Plus, there is a podcast planning worksheet. Once you fill it out, you are ready to move forward and launch. If self paced online courses are not your thing, I get it. If you prefer to work live with me via Zoom, I am opening up a small class of 4 to 6 students starting in mid October, October 23rd. I will be advertising this next week, starting October 2nd. If you are interested, even if you're a current student of mine, the cost is $1,000 for anybody who's already enrolled in my self-paced online course, or $1,249 US for anyone who is not enrolled. You get the self-paced online course and 6 90-minute live classes with me via Zoom. I know you may not like online self paced courses, but you have to go through the assigned modules and do your homework from the podcast planning worksheet before class. Then I'll work with you to answer any questions and get you pointed in the right direction. This is accountability and coaching. And since all of my students are pharmacy professionals or they think like pharmacy professionals, you may even get feedback from your classmates. It may be kind of like a live pharmacy podcasting mastermind. You will probably love it. And you'll also then have a plan for starting your own podcast. You may be able to start a podcast by Christmas. How exciting is that? You could launch your podcast yet this year in 2023. If you're interested in adding podcaster to your resume, sign up in October. I'll be taking applications starting next week. Class will start the week of October 23rd, but applications will be accepted starting October 2nd. I'm looking forward to mentoring some new podcasters, so come on out and join my class. That's all for today. Thank you so much for listening to episode 244 of the Pharmacist Voice podcast. Please visit thepharmacistvoice.com to read the show notes. In the show notes, you will find a link to my podcast planning course for pharmacy professionals, my social media links, and more. If you know a pharmacy professional who wants to plan a podcast, please share this episode with them. And if you like this podcast, please subscribe to or follow the Pharmacist Voice podcast on your favorite podcast player and YouTube to get each new episode right when it comes out. Join me next week, October 6th, for my next solo show. That will be a drug name pronunciation episode. If you've ever listened to that series, you know that I love those. Thanks for listening today. I'll talk to you next Friday.